What if I told you that a country's entire economic collapse could be predicted, not by politicians, not by analysts, but by a single set of numbers? Numbers that were available years ago, numbers that nobody wanted to read, numbers that Cuba's own government tried to hide until they couldn't anymore. Because here is the truth that this video is built on. Numbers never lie. Politicians lie, governments lie, state media lies, but numbers, cold, hard, mathematical numbers, they always tell the truth, eventually. And the numbers coming out of Cuba right now are telling a story so devastating, so precise, so mathematically inevitable that once you see them, you cannot unsee them. Let's start with the one number that defines everything. Cuba's GDP has contracted by 14% in just 4 years. 14%. To put that in perspective, the United States during the Great Depression, the worst economic collapse in American history, saw GDP fall by about 15% over 4 years. Cuba has nearly matched the Great Depression, not over decades, not after a world war, in 4 years, right now, in 2026. But that's just the beginning. Cuba's inflation rate has crossed 500% annually. That means something that cost 1 Cuban peso last year now costs 6 pesos today. Salaries have not moved, pensions have not moved, but prices have exploded. In economic terms, this is called hyperinflation. In human terms, it means a retired teacher who spent 40 years serving her country can no longer afford rice. Let that sit for a moment. Now here is where the geography becomes critical to understanding this crisis. Cuba is an island, and being an island changes everything economically. Cuba cannot simply drive to a neighboring country and buy supplies. Every single imported good, fuel, medicine, wheat, cooking oil, machinery parts, must arrive by ship. And ships cost money, foreign currency, dollars, euros, currency that Cuba is running out of at an accelerating rate. Cuba's foreign currency reserves have dropped to levels so critically low that the government has stopped publishing the official figures. When a government stops publishing its own economic data, that is not a coincidence. That is a confession. The last time Cuba publicly reported foreign reserves, they were enough to cover approximately 23 days of imports. That was 18 months ago. Economic analysts tracking Cuba's situation believe the real number today is closer to single digits. Single-digit days of import coverage for an island nation that imports 70% of its food. Do you understand what that means? Cuba does not grow enough food to feed itself. It never has under the current system. It relies on imports for the majority of what its 11 million citizens eat every single day, and the financial mechanism that pays for those imports is almost completely exhausted. But here is the number that stopped every economist who studies Cuba completely cold when it was leaked 3 weeks ago. Cuba's debt-to-GDP ratio has now exceeded 90%. 90%. That is the threshold that economic research has repeatedly identified as the point of no return, the level at which a country's debt burden becomes mathematically impossible to escape without either defaulting, restructuring, or collapsing entirely. Cuba has crossed that line. And unlike Greece in 2010, unlike Argentina in 2001, unlike Lebanon in 2019, Cuba has no international safety net waiting to catch it, no IMF rescue package, no European Central Bank, no friendly neighbors with deep enough pockets. Just numbers, falling numbers, and a clock that is running out faster than anyone in Havana is willing to admit publicly. But what caused these numbers to get this bad this fast? The answer involves a financial web so complicated and so deliberately hidden that it took investigators years to untangle it. And what they found inside that web will completely reframe everything you thought you knew about Cuba's economy. There is a reason Cuba's economic collapse looks so sudden to the outside world. It isn't sudden at all. It was hidden, deliberately, systematically, and with remarkable sophistication for a government that the world has consistently underestimated. To understand how Cuba concealed the true state of its finances for so long, you need to understand one fundamental thing about Cuban economics. Cuba operates not one economy, but two, simultaneously, side by side, and the gap between those two economies is where the truth has been buried for decades. The first economy is the one Cuba shows the world. State-controlled, centrally planned, built on revolutionary principles. This is the economy that appears in government reports, the one that gets presented to visiting journalists and sympathetic foreign academics, the one that claims Cuba has world-class healthcare and near-perfect literacy and a resilient, resourceful population that has survived against all odds. And some of that is partially true. But the second economy, the real economy, tells a completely different story. The real Cuban economy runs on a parallel currency system that has created two classes of citizens, those with access to foreign currency, dollars, euros, Canadian dollars, and those without. Cubans who receive remittances from family abroad can shop at special government stores stocked with imported goods. Cubans who have only Cuban pesos, the majority, are left competing for whatever scraps the state rationing system provides. This dual economy created a financial illusion that masked the true collapse for years. Here is how the illusion worked. When Cuba needed to show economic activity, it could point to the dollar stores. Look, goods are moving, commerce is happening, the economy is functioning. But those dollar stores were not evidence of economic health, they were evidence of economic extraction. The government was capturing foreign remittance dollars sent to Cuban Americans to their families and recycling them through state-controlled stores at enormous markups. It was not a market. It was a trap. And for a while, it worked brilliantly as a financial concealment mechanism. But then two things happened simultaneously that broke the illusion completely. First, remittances dropped sharply. Tightened U.S. regulations made it harder and more expensive to send money to Cuba. The flow of dollars that had been quietly keeping the parallel economy alive began to slow to a trickle. Between 2020 and 2024, remittance flows to Cuba dropped by an estimated 40%. 40% of the financial oxygen that was keeping the real economy breathing, gone. Second, COVID destroyed Cuban tourism entirely. Now here is where the geography of Cuba becomes economically devastating in a way most people never consider. Tourism was not just a nice addition to Cuba's economy. It was the primary legitimate source of foreign currency the government had left after losing Soviet subsidies. Hundreds of thousands of Canadian and European tourists arriving every year, bringing dollars and euros that the state could capture and recycle. COVID shut that pipeline completely in 2020, and Cuban tourism has never recovered. Visitor numbers in 2024 were still less than 40% of pre-COVID levels. The hotels are half empty, the restaurants are struggling, the foreign currency that tourism generated has largely disappeared. So, simultaneously, Cuba lost its remittance income, lost its tourism income, lost its Venezuelan oil subsidy, and began drowning in debt payments it had no mechanism to service. But here is the part that the numbers reveal with brutal mathematical clarity. Cuba did not respond to this triple financial shock by reforming, by opening, by making the structural changes that economists had been recommending for 30 years. Cuba responded by printing money. Between 2020 and 2024, Cuba's money supply expanded by over 400%. They printed pesos to pay government workers, printed pesos to fund state enterprises that produced nothing, printed pesos to maintain the appearance of a functioning state while the real economy disintegrated beneath the surface. And printed money always finds its way into inflation. Which brings us back to that 500% annual inflation number from Part 1. That inflation was not an accident. It was the mathematical inevitable result of a government that chose to print its way out of a crisis instead of confronting it. But printing money only buys time. It does not buy solutions. And Cuba just ran out of time. Because what happened next, the event that pushed Cuba from a managed decline into a full-speed collapse, was something nobody in Havana predicted. Something that came not from Washington, not from Miami, not from any of Cuba's traditional adversaries. It came from the one place Cuba thought it could always count on. And when you find out what happened there and when, you will understand why Cuban officials are no longer sleeping at night. Every collapsing nation has a moment, a single turning point, the exact moment when decline became freefall. For Cuba, that moment did not come from Washington's sanctions. It did not come from a failed harvest or a devastating hurricane. It did not come from internal protest or military mutiny. It came from Caracas, Venezuela, and it came quietly, slowly, almost invisibly at first, like a rope fraying one thread at a time until the day it snapped completely and Cuba fell. To understand the full weight of this betrayal, you need to understand exactly how dependent Cuba had become on Venezuelan oil. This was not a trade relationship. This was not a business partnership between two sovereign nations exchanging goods at market rates. This was financial life support. At the peak of the relationship, Venezuela was sending Cuba approximately 100,000 barrels of oil every single day at heavily subsidized prices, far below market rates. Cuba was paying for this oil not in dollars, because Cuba had no dollars, but in services. Cuban doctors deployed across Venezuela, Cuban military advisors embedded in Venezuelan security services, Cuban intelligence operatives helping Nicolás Maduro maintain his grip on power. It was one of the most unusual economic arrangements in modern geopolitical history, and for Cuba, it was everything. That Venezuelan oil powered Cuba's electricity plants. It fueled the trucks that moved food from farms to cities. It heated the hospitals. It kept the basic mechanical infrastructure of an entire nation functioning. Without it, Cuba was not a struggling economy. Without it, Cuba was a tropical island with 11 million people and no power source. Now here is where the economics and geography intersect in a way that makes Cuba's situation uniquely catastrophic compared to other nations facing similar challenges. Cuba has no domestic oil production worth mentioning. Whatever shallow offshore reserves Cuba possesses have proven largely inaccessible without the advanced drilling technology that foreign companies, scared off by U.S. sanctions, refuse to bring to the island. Cuba cannot drill its way out of this crisis. The geology does not support it, and the geopolitical environment prevents the investment needed to try. So, when Venezuelan oil shipments began declining, Cuba had no backup plan. And they declined fast. Venezuela's own oil production has been collapsing for years. At its peak in the late 1990s, Venezuela produced over 3 million barrels of oil per day. By 2024, that number had fallen below 800,000 barrels per day. A catastrophic decline driven by mismanagement, corruption, lack of investment, and the exodus of skilled petroleum engineers who could no longer earn a living wage in a collapsing economy. Venezuela was running out of oil to send because Venezuela was running out of the capacity to produce oil at all. The shipments to Cuba dropped from 100,000 barrels per day to 60,000, then to 40,000, then to somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000, the last figures that independent analysts could verify before the data went dark entirely. And then came the moment that changed everything. In late 2024, Venezuela informed Cuba that it could no longer guarantee regular oil shipments at any price. The infrastructure to deliver the oil reliably no longer existed. The tankers were aging and unmaintained. The loading terminals were operating at minimal capacity. Venezuela was not choosing to abandon Cuba. Venezuela was collapsing too fast to save anyone else. Two socialist allies, two economies built on the same flawed financial principles, both collapsing simultaneously. Each one unable to help the other because both were drowning at the same time. The economic term for what Cuba experienced when Venezuelan oil disappeared is called an external shock, but that clinical phrase does not capture what actually happened on the ground in Cuba when the oil stopped arriving consistently. Power plants that ran on oil went dark. Backup generators that hospitals depended on ran dry within weeks. The trucks that moved food sat idle in government yards because there was no diesel to put in them. Food rotted in warehouses outside Havana because there was no fuel to complete the final miles of delivery to the people who needed it. And the government, the same government that had managed every aspect of Cuban life for 65 years, found itself completely powerless to solve a problem that required the one thing it had never been able to generate: hard currency to buy oil on the open international market at real prices. Cuba went to that market and discovered something humiliating. Its credit was gone. Its reputation as a borrower was destroyed by decades of defaults and restructurings and broken agreements with creditors across Russia, China, Europe, and Latin America. Nobody would lend Cuba the money to buy the oil it needed to keep its own lights on. Think about that for a moment. A government that controls every bank, every business, every farm, every factory on its territory could not borrow enough money to buy fuel. That is not just an economic failure. That is the final verdict on 65 years of a system that consumed everything and produced almost nothing that the outside world was willing to pay for. But here's what makes this story even more extraordinary. Inside Cuba, on the streets of Havana, in the small towns of Oriente province, in the fishing villages along the southern coast, ordinary Cuban people had already figured all of this out long before their government admitted any of it. And what they were doing in response to that knowledge was building something entirely unexpected, something the Cuban government never anticipated, never planned, and has absolutely no idea how to stop.
Governments can control many things. They can control borders, control media, control movement, control speech. But there is one thing no government in human history has ever successfully controlled for long: human ingenuity when survival is at stake. And right now, underneath the collapsing official economy of Cuba, something extraordinary is happening. Something that economists who study failed states find both fascinating and historically significant. Something that the Cuban government watches with a mixture of desperate relief and existential terror. An entire parallel economy is rising from the rubble, and its growth rate is accelerating faster than anyone predicted. Let's talk about what this looks like on the ground, because the numbers here are just as revealing as the macroeconomic figures we examined earlier, just far more human. In 2021, Cuba passed a historic piece of legislation almost nobody outside the island noticed. For the first time since the revolution, Cuba legalized small and medium private businesses, not enthusiastically, not generously, but legally. A Cuban citizen could now, for the first time in 6 decades, register a private company and operate it without being classified as a criminal exploiting the working class. The government expected modest uptake, a few thousand small restaurants perhaps, some repair shops, modest private enterprise at the margins of an economy that would remain fundamentally state-controlled. What actually happened broke every projection the government had made. Within 18 months of legalization, over 8,000 private businesses had registered in Cuba. By 2024, that number had crossed 11,000. Restaurants, bakeries, transportation services, construction companies, technology repair shops, agricultural suppliers, import brokers working through third countries to bring goods into Cuba through the gaps in the sanctions regime. 11,000 private businesses in a country where private business was illegal for 60 years. But here is the number that truly reveals the scale of what is happening beneath the surface of Cuba's official collapse. Economists studying Cuba's informal economy, the unregistered, unreported, cash-based transactions that happen every single day across the island, now estimate that the informal sector accounts for between 40 and 50% of all real economic activity in Cuba. Nearly half of Cuba's actual economy is now invisible to the state. Think about what that means financially. The Cuban government taxes and controls and monitors the official economy, but the official economy is shrinking toward irrelevance. Meanwhile, the informal economy, the one keeping millions of Cubans actually fed and functioning, operates almost entirely outside government reach, outside government revenue, outside government control. The state is becoming economically irrelevant in its own country. And the geography of this informal economy is fascinating. It does not exist equally across Cuba. It is concentrated in specific places that have specific advantages. Havana, obviously, where population density creates markets, but also in the provinces closest to the coast, where fishermen trade their catch directly with private restaurant owners, bypassing state procurement entirely. In the agricultural regions of Holguín and Camagüey, where farmers are selling produce directly to private buyers at market prices rather than surrendering it to the state collection system at artificially low government rates. A decentralized market economy is spontaneously assembling itself across Cuba, without government permission, without government planning, without government support. And it is doing something that 65 years of central planning completely failed to do. It is actually feeding people. Private restaurants in Cuba, called paladares, are full, while state restaurants stand empty. Private food markets have produce, while government stores have bare shelves. Private transportation networks are moving people, while state bus systems are paralyzed by fuel shortages. Everywhere you look, the private sector is outperforming the state sector so dramatically and so visibly that ordinary Cuban citizens have drawn their own conclusions about which system actually works. But here is where this story takes its most unexpected turn. The Cuban government, the revolutionary government that built its entire identity on opposition to capitalism and private enterprise, is watching this informal market economy save its people, and it faces an impossible dilemma that strikes at the very core of its ideological identity. If it cracks down on the informal economy, tries to reassert state control, arrest the private traders, shut down the unofficial markets, it will trigger the food crisis to accelerate into outright famine. The informal economy is the only thing preventing complete nutritional collapse in many parts of the island. But if it allows the informal economy to continue growing, if it tacitly permits this spontaneous capitalism to expand, it is admitting that everything the revolution stood for was wrong, that markets work better than central planning, that individual incentive produces more than collective obligation, that the system Castro built and died defending was a 65-year detour that impoverished everyone it claimed to liberate. That is not just a policy dilemma. That is an existential identity crisis for an entire governing ideology. And right now, in closed party meetings that are becoming increasingly tense and fractured, Cuban Communist Party officials are fighting a bitter internal battle over which path to choose. The reformers inside the party are gaining ground, slowly, painfully, against enormous ideological resistance, but they are gaining ground. And what the reformers are proposing, the specific economic plan they have drafted and are now pushing through internal party channels, is so dramatic, so radical, so completely contrary to everything Cuba has stood for since 1959, that when it leaks to the public, it will send shockwaves across every remaining socialist government on Earth. We know what that plan contains, and we are going to tell you exactly what it proposes. In the final part, because the last chapter of Cuba's story is not written yet, and the ending, the real ending, is not the anyone is expecting.
Here is the truth that all the numbers have been building toward. Cuba has 3 doors left, just 3. Door 1, approach the United States, offer political concessions, accept economic opening, end 65 years of revolutionary identity in exchange for survival. Humiliating, necessary, and politically almost impossible for a government built entirely on anti-American resistance. Door 2, print more money, borrow more time, keep blaming external enemies, keep arresting dissidents, keep pretending, until the people stop accepting pretending, until the streets fill with hunger instead of fear. History tells us exactly how that ending looks. Door 3, a managed internal transformation, quiet market reforms, controlled opening, the Vietnam model, the China model, survival through pragmatism rather than ideology, the only door that leads somewhere livable. But here is the brutal final truth. Every day Cuba delays choosing, the choice gets made for them, by the numbers.
11 million people cannot eat ideology. They cannot heat their homes with revolutionary slogans. They cannot feed their children with 65 years of resistance. The informal economy is already showing Cuba what works. Private businesses are already feeding people the state cannot feed. The market is already winning, quietly, unofficially, unstoppably. Cuba does not need to discover capitalism. Cuba is already living it, secretly, desperately, successfully. The only question left is whether the government will finally admit what every Cuban citizen already knows. The numbers never lied. They were just waiting for someone in power to finally read them. The clock is still running, and Cuba is almost out of time.